thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate your time. Let's talk about this this new Congress. The last Congress we just had, by I think a lot of people's standards, was maybe a little less than productive. Is this Congress, do you see any reason it's going to be any different? Because a lot of the same people came back to Washington. Is this Congress going to be different than the last Congress?
Well, that's a good question. I think many people hope it will be better, but if you look at the makeup of the Congress, it may be even more polarized, because what's happened is in the U.S. Senate, they've actually added a few very liberal Democrats and subtracted a few Republicans. And the Senate has traditionally, in the last few years, been controlled by Democrats. The House, meanwhile, although it did add a few Democrats, it's still controlled by Republicans, and many of them are quite conservative. So it remains to be seen. I talked to Senator McCaskill right after her swearing in last week, and she's somewhat optimistic given the last-minute deal on the Fiscal Cliff. Even though neither side particularly liked what came out of it, she thinks that at least there was a precedent for some compromise.
In the Senate, anyway. We'll talk about the Fiscal Cliff. That's something that they brought down to the wire there, and some aspects of it were a little bit of a punt, would you say? I don't know. Did they? What can you help us understand? What did actually get done on the Fiscal Cliff there at the end of the year, the very first day of the new year?
Well, they did take care of what most sides considered the big issue, which was extending most of the Bush-era tax cuts. However, they punted really on the spending issues. And that's where we're going to see what some would describe as the next sort of a mini fiscal cliff in about 2 months. At that point, the so-called sequestration, those are across the board automatic cuts to everything in the budget, mainly defense, are going to kick in unless Congress reaches another compromise. And what's also forcing a compromise is that the federal government will reach what's called its debt ceiling, probably in mid to late February. So Congress has to raise that debt ceiling, otherwise, in effect, the government defaults. I don't think the Congress will allow a default, but I think that that's going to push for action.
Well, the president will never run for another elected office. Do you see his demeanor different in his second term than it was in his first? And how could that possibly play out?
I think President Obama will be more concerned with his long-term legacy in the second term. As you say, he won't run again personally for political office. I think that the momentum from his election in November will carry him for a year or so, but then after that, traditionally, second-term presidents tend to be regarded as lame ducks, and some of their agenda is ignored unless their party controls both houses of Congress. So I think the president realizes that if he's going to get major initiatives accomplished, he needs to do it this year and next year. That's why I expect in his State of the Union address, which will be, I think, later this month, he will stress at least two major initiatives. One would be immigration reform, which, among other things, would probably create something like the so-called DREAM Act that would create a path for citizenship for young people whose parents brought them into this country illegally, but who have lived all their lives here. And then I think there'll be another initiative related to gun control in response to the shootings in Connecticut in December. Vice President Biden is working on something, and I believe that President Obama plans at least to outline what he will ask Congress to do later this month.
Let's talk about the Affordable Care Act. This is something that we know in Missouri voters do not get behind, but it's going ahead. What do you see in Washington? Any efforts, first of all, I guess, any final efforts by Republicans to push back and stop what is referred to as Obamacare in this new Congress?
There will be efforts by Republicans to repeal Obamacare, but they won't be successful. Obviously, the Senate is controlled by Democrats. It's not going to allow it to happen, and President Obama would clearly veto any such legislation. Most of the action, I think, related to Obamacare is going to happen in the states, particularly in the state of Missouri. You have the governor proposing expansion of Medicaid, which, if it's successful, would allow the state to pick up more federal assistance on Medicaid, at least for the first 2 or 3 years. However, the Republican-controlled state legislature is fighting that, and that will be an interesting battle.
Let's change gears just a little bit. The economy has added some jobs steadily over the last few months, but that unemployment percentage has stayed right there, just below 8%. What do you see? Do you see any initiative coming out of Congress on the economy, on jobs in particular, or is there what's the thinking there?
Well, the general feeling is that if ways can be found to stimulate the economy, then jobs naturally will start growing again. And one way to stimulate the economy, at least Republicans believe, is to reform or revamp the income tax system, which right now is quite complicated in a way that would promote more investment by businesses. And I think there will be a legitimate effort, both by Republicans and Democrats, for some sort of a tax reform. Traditionally, tax reform is very difficult to accomplish because there are so many interests lobbying on various parts of the tax package, but I think there'll be an effort to do that. Now, directly, the main way that the federal government can increase job growth would be by something like the stimulus program that was tried 3 or 4 years ago. And part of that would involve infrastructure improvements. In other words, a longer-term transportation bill that would call for more money at the federal level to be spent on rehabbing bridges, rebuilding highways, expanding other large transportation infrastructure projects. I think there'll be an effort to do that. Whether the money will be in the budget after these budget cuts that are expected, I don't know. I think that would be one direct method of increasing the number of jobs.